I always imagined spending my golden years hosting Christmas dinners in a house filled with laughter, grandchildren unwrapping presents under my tree, and the warm smell of turkey filling every corner. But when my daughter-in-law told me I wasn't welcome at their Christmas table, the table in the house I'd been secretly paying for, I made one phone call that changed everything forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and at 69 years old, I never thought I'd be sitting alone in my small apartment in Maplewood Heights on Christmas Eve, staring at a phone number I'd memorized but hoped I'd never have to use. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a retired high school English teacher who'd spent 43 years teaching students about the power of words and communication, and I couldn't even get my own family to include me in their holiday plans. Maplewood Heights used to be a thriving mill town nestled in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, but like so many places, it had seen better days. The old textile factory where my late husband Gerald worked for 30 years had closed down a decade ago, leaving behind empty buildings and memories. Gerald and I had lived our entire married life in a cozy 2-story house on Elm Street, where we raised our son Marcus and dreamed of filling it with grandchildren during the holidays. Those dreams felt like a lifetime ago now. Gerald passed away 4 years ago after a brief but fierce battle with lung cancer, leaving me with a modest pension, his life insurance policy, and a profound loneliness that seemed to echo through every room of our family home. The house had become too big, too quiet, and too full of memories, so I'd made the difficult decision to sell it and move into a senior living community called Sunset Gardens. It wasn't what I'd planned for my retirement, but it was practical and safe. Marcus, my only child, was 36 years old and worked as a regional sales manager for an office supply company. He traveled frequently throughout the tri-state area, staying in hotels 3 nights a week and coming home exhausted every Thursday evening. He'd inherited his father's gentle nature and kind heart, but also Gerald's tendency to avoid confrontation at all costs. As a child, Marcus would rather hide in his room than deal with playground bullies, and as an adult, he still seemed to shrink away from difficult conversations. 5 years ago, Marcus married Vivian Ashford, a striking woman with auburn hair and piercing green eyes who worked as an office manager at Riverside Medical Center. At 32, Vivian was everything I wasn't: polished, ambitious, and absolutely certain about what she wanted in life. When Marcus first brought her home for dinner, I was genuinely happy for him. She was beautiful, well-spoken, and seemed to adore my son. During their engagement, she would call me regularly, asking for advice about wedding planning and sharing her excitement about starting a family. "I can't wait for you to be a grandmother, Eleanor," she'd say with what seemed like genuine warmth. "Our children are going to be so lucky to have you." I remember their wedding day vividly, a lavish affair at the Riverside Country Club that cost more than Gerald and I had spent on our first car. Vivian looked radiant in her designer gown, and Marcus couldn't stop smiling as they exchanged vows. During the reception, she pulled me aside and hugged me tightly. "Thank you for raising such a wonderful man," she whispered in my ear. "I promise, I'll take good care of him." At the time, I believed her completely. The first sign that things might not be as perfect as they seemed came about a year into their marriage. Marcus and Vivian had been renting a small apartment in downtown Riverside, about 30 minutes from Maplewood Heights, but Vivian had become obsessed with buying a house. Not just any house. She wanted something in Willowbrook Estates, an upscale development with manicured lawns, 3-car garages, and an exclusive country club membership. "It's about building equity," she would tell Marcus during family dinners at my house. "We can't throw money away on rent forever. Besides, when we have children, we'll need space for them to grow up safely." The problem was that houses in Willowbrook Estates started at around $300,000, well beyond what a traveling salesman and medical office manager could realistically afford. Marcus would nod along with Vivian's house hunting enthusiasm, but I could see the stress in his eyes when she pulled up listings on her phone during dessert. "Look at this one," she'd say, scrolling through photos of granite countertops and walk-in closets. "It has 4 bedrooms and a finished basement. Perfect for entertaining." Marcus would smile weakly and change the subject, but Vivian was persistent. She had a vision of their future that seemed to require a lifestyle significantly above their means, and she wasn't easily deterred by practical concerns like mortgage payments and property taxes. During those early conversations about house hunting, I watched my son struggle with disappointing his wife while trying to be realistic about their finances. Gerald had always taught Marcus to live within his means and save for the future, but Vivian's dreams were expensive, and her determination was unwavering. Looking back now, as I sat in my small apartment on Christmas Eve with the mortgage company's number burning a hole in my memory, I realized that this was where our story really began. Not with the Christmas dinner invitation that never came, but with a young couple's dream of home ownership and a mother's desire to help her only child achieve happiness, whatever the cost. I had no idea that my good intentions would eventually lead to the most difficult decision of my life, a decision that would change everything for all of us. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in March when Marcus called me, his voice carrying that familiar tone of nervous excitement that I remembered from his childhood when he wanted to ask for something important but wasn't sure how to approach it. "Mom, would you mind if Vivian and I stop by for dinner tonight?" he asked, and I could hear traffic in the background as he spoke from his car. "We have something we'd like to discuss with you." I was delighted, of course. Since moving to Sunset Gardens 8 months earlier, I'd been seeing Marcus and Vivian less frequently. They claimed it was because my new apartment was out of the way from their usual routes, though Maplewood Heights was only 20 minutes from their apartment. In Riverside, still, any opportunity to spend time with my son was precious to me. I spent the afternoon preparing Marcus's favorite meal, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, fresh dinner rolls, and apple pie for dessert. The small kitchen in my apartment wasn't designed for elaborate cooking, but I managed to create a feast that would have made Gerald proud. As I worked, I found myself humming Christmas carols from the previous holiday season, remembering how Vivian had complimented my cooking and asked for my apple pie recipe. Marcus and Vivian arrived at 6:30 sharp, both dressed more formally than usual. Marcus wore a button-down shirt and tie, despite having finished work hours earlier, and Vivian had on a navy blue dress that I recognized as one of her more expensive purchases. She carried a bottle of wine and a small bouquet of flowers, grocery store carnations, but thoughtful nonetheless. "Eleanor, thank you so much for making dinner," Vivian said, kissing my cheek as she handed me the flowers. "You always go to so much trouble for us." During dinner, the conversation was lighter than usual. Vivian told me about a new doctor who had joined the medical center, and Marcus shared a funny story about a client in Philadelphia who had ordered 300 staplers by mistake. They both seemed unusually animated, almost giddy, and I found myself caught up in their infectious energy. It wasn't until I was serving the apple pie that Marcus cleared his throat and exchanged a meaningful look with Vivian. "Mom," he began, setting down his fork and folding his hands on the table. "Vivian and I have some exciting news to share with you." I felt my heart skip a beat, immediately thinking they were going to announce a pregnancy. Gerald and I had always dreamed of grandchildren, and at 69, I was more than ready to embrace the role of grandmother. "We found a house," Vivian announced, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "The perfect house. It's everything we've been looking for." I tried to hide my slight disappointment. I'd been hoping for different news, but forced a smile. "That's wonderful. Tell me about it." Vivian immediately pulled out her phone and began scrolling through photos. "It's in Willowbrook Estates, just like we always wanted. 4 bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen with granite countertops, and the most beautiful master suite you've ever seen. She turned the phone toward me, and I had to admit the house was stunning. It was a colonial-style home with a 2-car garage, professionally landscaped yard, and an impressive front porch with white columns. It looked like something from a magazine. Not the type of home a young couple just starting out would typically be able to afford. "It's lovely," I said honestly, though something in my stomach began to tighten with worry. "How much are they asking?" $285,000, Marcus replied, his voice slightly strained. "But the seller is motivated, and our real estate agent thinks we can get it for $270. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but the mathematics were simple and concerning. Even at the lower price, they would need at least 15 to 20% down to avoid private mortgage insurance, plus closing costs and moving expenses. That would require somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000. Money I was quite certain they didn't have. "That's quite an investment," I said carefully. "Have you been able to save for the down payment?" Vivian's smile flickered slightly, and Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This was the moment they'd been building toward all evening, and we all knew it. "Well, that's actually what we wanted to talk to you about," Vivian said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "We have some savings, but not quite enough for the down payment. We were hoping—" She paused, glancing at Marcus for support. "We were hoping you might be able to help us," Marcus finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just with part of the down payment. We'd pay you back, of course, with interest if you want." The request hung in the air between us like smoke from Gerald's old pipe. I looked at my son, my sweet, earnest son who had never asked me for anything significant in his adult life, and saw the hope and desperation in his eyes. Then I looked at Vivian, who was watching me with an intensity that made me slightly uncomfortable. "How much would you need?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. $45,000, Vivian said quickly, as if getting the number out fast would make it seem smaller. "It would cover the down payment and closing costs, and we'd have the house. Our dream house, Eleanor. The place where we want to start our family." $45,000. It was more than half of Gerald's life insurance money, which I'd been carefully saving for emergencies and my own future care. It was my safety net, my security blanket, the difference between comfortable retirement and potential financial hardship. But as I looked at Marcus, I saw something else in his expression, a vulnerability that reminded me of the little boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, seeking comfort and protection. This was my son, my only child, asking for help to build the life he wanted with the woman he loved. "You'd really pay me back?" I asked, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew the answer didn't matter. I was going to say yes regardless. "Absolutely," Vivian said firmly. "We wouldn't dream of taking advantage of your generosity. This is a loan, Eleanor, not a gift. We insist on that." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "Mom, I promise you we'll pay back every penny. With my promotion next year and Vivian's possible raise, we'll be able to start making payments within 6 months." I studied their faces, Marcus's earnest sincerity and Vivian's confident determination, and made the decision that would change the trajectory of all our lives. "All right," I said softly. "If this is what you really want, if this house will make you happy, then yes, I'll help you with the down payment." The transformation in their faces was immediate and dramatic. Marcus's eyes filled with tears, and he jumped up from his chair to hug me so tightly I could barely breathe. Vivian clapped her hands together and let out a small squeal of delight. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," Marcus whispered against my shoulder. "You're the best mother in the world." As I held my son and watched Vivian already pulling up mortgage calculators on her phone, I felt a warm glow of satisfaction. This was what mothers did. They helped their children achieve their dreams, even when it required sacrifice. I had no way of knowing that this moment of generosity would eventually lead to the loneliest Christmas Eve of my life, or that the phone number I'd memorized would become the key to reclaiming my dignity and self-respect. For now, I was simply a mother who had said yes to her child's dreams, and that felt like enough. The house closing took place on a warm Thursday morning in May, at the offices of Riverside Title Company. I had withdrawn the $45,000 from my savings account the day before, converting Gerald's life insurance money into a cashier's check that felt heavier than it should have in my purse. Marcus had insisted on picking me up from Sunset Gardens, and during the 20-minute drive to the title office, he couldn't stop talking about their plans for the house. "Vivian wants to paint the master bedroom a soft gray," he said, drumming his fingers excitedly on the steering wheel. "And we're thinking about putting in a vegetable garden in the backyard. Remember how Dad always grew those amazing tomatoes?" I smiled, remembering Gerald's pride in his small garden plot behind our old house. He would have loved to see you continuing that tradition. The title office was bustling with activity. Other families making similar leaps of faith, signing documents that would tie them to mortgages for the next 30 years. Marcus and Vivian sat side by side at a long conference table, Vivian's hand resting possessively on Marcus's arm as the title officer explained each document in detail. "This is your monthly payment schedule," the officer said, sliding a paper across the table. "Principal and interest will be $1,847 per month, plus property taxes and insurance, bringing your total monthly payment to approximately $2,200. I watched Marcus's face carefully as he absorbed this information. $2,200 was more than half his monthly income, and while Vivian made decent money at the medical center, their combined income still made this payment a significant stretch. But Vivian signed each document with a flourish, her confidence never wavering. "We're really doing this," she whispered to Marcus as they signed the final papers. "We're homeowners." When it was time for my check, Vivian squeezed my hand. "Eleanor, I want you to know how much this means to us. We'll never forget what you're doing for our future." I handed over the cashier's check, watching as $45,000, money Gerald had worked overtime shifts to provide through his life, insurance, officially became their down payment. The title officer processed the check efficiently, and just like that, Marcus and Vivian owned their dream house in Willowbrook Estates. The celebration afterward was subdued, but happy. We went to lunch at Romano's Italian restaurant, where Marcus ordered champagne and made a toast. "To Mom," he said, raising his glass, "for believing in our dreams and making them possible. To our new beginning," Vivian added, clinking her glass against mine. "And to family." I felt genuine happiness for them in that moment. Yes, I had depleted most of my savings, but seeing the joy on my son's face made it feel worthwhile. This was what parents did. They sacrificed so their children could have better lives than they'd had. The first few months of home ownership seemed to validate my decision. Marcus called regularly to update me on their progress settling into the house. They bought new furniture piece by piece, hosted a small housewarming party for their friends, and Vivian even started talking seriously about trying to get pregnant. "We want to wait until we're really established," she told me during one of our phone conversations. "But maybe next year we'll start trying. Wouldn't that be wonderful?" But by September, I began to notice subtle changes in their communication patterns. Marcus's calls became less frequent, and when we did talk, he sounded stressed and tired. When I asked about their plans to start repaying the loan, he would quickly change the subject or mention that they were still getting settled financially. The call that changed everything came on a crisp October morning while I was having breakfast in the community dining room at Sunset Gardens. My phone rang, and I recognized the number as First National Bank, where I had my checking and savings accounts. "Mrs. Hartwell," the customer service representative said, "I'm calling about your son Marcus Hartwell's mortgage account. You're listed as a reference, and we've been trying to reach him about some missed payments. My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. Missed payments? Yes, ma'am. He's now 60 days behind on his mortgage. We've sent several notices to his home address, but we haven't received any response. Since you're listed as a contact, we wanted to reach out and see if you might be able to help us get in touch with him. After I hung up, I sat staring at my phone for several minutes, trying to process what I'd just learned. Marcus and Vivian had missed 2 mortgage payments, nearly $4,400. Where was the money going? Marcus was still working, and as far as I knew, Vivian hadn't lost her job at the medical center. I called Marcus immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried again an hour later with the same result. Finally, that evening, he called me back. "Hey, Mom," he said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "Sorry I missed your calls. It's been a crazy day." "Marcus," I said gently, "I received a call from your mortgage company today. They said you've missed 2 payments. Is everything all right?" There was a long pause, and I could hear Vivian's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "It's just a temporary cash flow problem," Marcus finally said. "Vivian had some unexpected medical expenses, dental work that wasn't covered by insurance, and my company changed our expense reimbursement policy, so I'm having to front more money for travel costs. We'll catch up next month." Something in his voice didn't ring entirely true, but I didn't want to push too hard. "Are you sure you don't need help? I might be able to—" "No, Mom," Marcus interrupted quickly. "We're fine. Really. This is just a temporary setback. We don't want to burden you any more than we already have." After we hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than Marcus was telling me. Over the next 2 weeks, I found myself thinking constantly about that phone call from the bank. The young couple who had promised so confidently to repay my $45,000 loan couldn't even make their mortgage payments. 3 weeks later, the bank called again. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is David Chen from First National Bank. I spoke with you last month about your son's mortgage. Unfortunately, he's now 90 days behind, and we're required to begin foreclosure proceedings if payment isn't received within 10 days. Foreclosure. The word hit me like a physical blow. Marcus and Vivian could lose their house. The house I had helped them buy with Gerald's life insurance money. That afternoon, I drove to Willowbrook Estates for the first time since the closing. I told myself I was just going to see how they were settling in, but really, I needed to understand what was happening with my own eyes. The house looked beautiful from the outside. The lawn was perfectly manicured, and I could see new patio furniture on the back deck. A expensive-looking SUV sat in the driveway next to Marcus's sedan, something I didn't remember them having before. I didn't knock on the door. Instead, I sat in my car across the street, watching the house I had helped purchase and wondering how my son and daughter-in-law could afford new furniture and vehicles while missing mortgage payments. That evening, I made a decision that would define the next 4 years of my life. Without telling Marcus or Vivian, without telling anyone, I called First National Bank and spoke with David Chen. "Mr. Chen," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'd like to set up automatic payments from my checking account to cover my son's mortgage. Can you arrange that?" "Certainly, Mrs. Hartwell. Are you sure about this? It's a significant monthly payment, $2,200. $2,200 was more than half my monthly pension and Social Security combined. It would mean cutting back on everything: groceries, entertainment, gifts, savings for my own future care. But the alternative was watching my son lose his home and knowing I could have prevented it." "I'm sure," I said. "Please set it up to begin, immediately." As I hung up the phone, I knew I had crossed a line from which there would be no easy return. I was no longer just Eleanor Hartwell, retired English teacher and widow. I was now Eleanor Hartwell, secret benefactor, financial enabler, and, though I didn't realize it yet, someone whose generosity would eventually be taken for granted and thrown back in her face. The automatic payment began the next month, and I told no one, not my few friends at Sunset Gardens, not my sister Martha in Ohio, and certainly not Marcus and Vivian. I convinced myself it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet financially. I had no idea that this decision would lead to 4 years of financial strain, growing resentment, and ultimately to the Christmas Eve when I would finally make the call that would change everything. The changes began subtly, like the first signs of autumn when you notice the leaves starting to turn, but the full transformation hasn't yet taken hold. For the first few months after I began making their mortgage payments, Marcus and Vivian seemed genuinely grateful for my initial down payment contribution. They invited me over for dinner twice in November, and Vivian even asked for my recipe for Gerald's favorite cornbread stuffing. But as winter settled over Maplewood Heights and spring approached, I started to notice small shifts in our relationship dynamic that left me feeling increasingly unsettled. The first change was in the frequency of our contact. Marcus had always been a dutiful son, calling me every Sunday evening without fail to check in about my week. These conversations were often the highlight of my otherwise quiet days at Sunset Gardens. We would talk about his work travels, my activities at the community center, and his plans with Vivian for the upcoming week. By February, those Sunday calls became sporadic. Sometimes Marcus would call on Tuesday, sometimes Thursday, and occasionally not at all during the week. When I gently mentioned missing our regular conversations, he would apologize and cite work stress or weekend plans with Vivian's friends. "You understand, Mom," he'd say, his voice carrying a slight edge of impatience. "We've got a lot going on with the new house and everything." The second change was in the nature of our interactions when we did speak. Our conversations, which had once been warm and meandering, became increasingly brief and perfunctory. Marcus would ask about my health and activities at Sunset Gardens, but I could sense him mentally checking off conversational obligations rather than engaging with genuine interest. "How was your book club this week?" he'd ask. But before I could finish describing our discussion of the 7 husbands of Evelyn Hugo, he'd already moved on to telling me about a client meeting in Pittsburgh or Vivian's latest project at work. More concerning was what he stopped asking about entirely. Marcus had always been attentive to my financial well-being, occasionally checking whether I needed help with anything around my apartment or if I was managing okay on my pension. Those caring inquiries disappeared completely, replaced by assumptions that everything was fine and required no further discussion. The third change became apparent when I started noticing their lifestyle upgrades through social media. Vivian had added me as a friend on Facebook shortly after their wedding, and initially, I'd enjoyed seeing photos of their home improvements and weekend adventures. But as I secretly continued making their mortgage payments, money that represented significant sacrifice on my part, I watched their posts document an increasingly lavish lifestyle that seemed impossible on their combined salaries. In March, Vivian posted photos of a weekend getaway to Atlantic City, complete with expensive dinners and casino gaming. In April, she shared images of a brand new dining room set from a high-end furniture store in Philadelphia. By May, Marcus had posted pictures of a golf weekend with friends at an exclusive resort in the Pocono Mountains. Each post felt like a small knife twist. While I was eating generic cereal for breakfast to stretch my grocery budget and postponing routine dental work to afford their mortgage payment, they were apparently living as if money was no object. The most painful realization came during one of Marcus's increasingly rare phone calls in June. He mentioned casually that they were thinking about taking a vacation to Cancun over the 4th of July weekend. "Vivian found this amazing resort package online," he said enthusiastically. 5 days, all-inclusive, right on the beach. We both really need the break." I gripped my phone tighter, calculating quickly in my head. A week in Cancun would easily cost $3,000 to $4,000, more than I had left in my savings account after depleting it for their down payment. "That sounds lovely," I managed to say. "You both work so hard, you deserve a nice vacation." "Thanks, Mom. Vivian's really excited about it. She's been so stressed with her job lately, and this will be perfect for helping her relax." After we hung up, I sat in my small living room staring at the stack of bills on my coffee table. Among them was a notice that my rent at Sunset Gardens would be increasing by $150 per month starting in August. The increase would stretch my already tight budget to the breaking point, but I couldn't bring myself to mention it to Marcus. How could I tell my son that I was struggling financially while he was planning expensive vacations? How could I explain that his mother, who had always been self-sufficient and proud of her independence, was now eating ramen noodles for dinner 3 nights a week to afford his mortgage payment? The disconnect became even more apparent when Marcus and Vivian began declining my invitations to visit. Throughout the first year of their homeownership, I had regularly invited them for Sunday dinners at Sunset Gardens. The community had a lovely dining room where residents could host guests, and I enjoyed showing off my son and daughter-in-law to my neighbors. But by summer, my invitations were consistently met with polite excuses. They had plans with friends. Vivian wasn't feeling well. Marcus had work to catch up on, or they were busy with house projects. When I suggested visiting them at their home instead, the responses were similarly evasive. "The house is such a mess right now," Vivian would say. "We're in the middle of renovating the guest bathroom and everything's torn up. Maybe in a few weeks when things are more settled." Those few weeks stretched into months, and I began to understand that I was no longer a priority in their newly established life in Willowbrook Estates. The most hurtful incident occurred in late July, when I accidentally discovered they had hosted a dinner party for 8 people, something I learned only because Vivian's sister commented on photos posted to Facebook. The images showed their beautifully decorated dining room filled with well-dressed couples, enjoying what appeared to be a catered meal, complete with wine service and professional-looking floral arrangements. I stared at those photos for a long time, wondering why I hadn't been invited to my own son's dinner party. Marcus and Vivian clearly had time for entertaining and money for elaborate meals, but somehow couldn't find room in their schedule for a simple visit with the woman who was secretly making their lifestyle possible. When I mentioned the party during our next phone conversation, Marcus seemed genuinely surprised that I knew about it. "Oh, that," he said dismissively. "It was just a work thing for Vivian. Some of her colleagues from the medical center. You wouldn't have known anyone there, Mom." The implication stung. I wasn't sophisticated enough for their new social circle, wasn't interesting enough to include in their dinner parties, wasn't worth the effort of maintaining a meaningful relationship now that they had achieved their dream of living in Willowbrook Estates. By the time autumn arrived, our relationship had settled into a pattern that felt more like distant relatives maintaining obligatory contact than a close mother and son. Marcus would call once or twice a month. Our conversations would last 15 to 20 minutes, and he would update me on surface-level details of their lives while showing little genuine interest in mine. Meanwhile, every month on the 15th, $2,200 automatically transferred from my checking account to First National Bank, ensuring that Marcus and Vivian could continue living in their beautiful house, while apparently forgetting that anyone had made sacrifices to help them achieve that dream. I told myself that this was normal, that newly married couples naturally became more independent from their parents. I convinced myself that their busy schedules and social obligations were signs of a healthy, active lifestyle rather than evidence that they were taking my financial support for granted. But deep down, in the quiet moments when I sat alone in my apartment eating another dinner of soup and crackers, I was beginning to understand that my generosity had fundamentally altered our relationship in ways I hadn't anticipated. Instead of creating gratitude and closeness, my secret financial support had somehow given them permission to treat me as less important, less deserving of their time and attention. I just didn't yet realize how much worse things would become, or that their growing indifference was only the beginning of a much more painful journey toward the loneliest Christmas Eve of my life. October brought the kind of crisp golden weather that had always made Pennsylvania autumns my favorite time of year. The maples around Sunset Gardens blazed with orange and red, and the community center had organized a harvest festival that drew families from all over Maplewood Heights. I was sitting on a bench outside the main building, watching children run through piles of leaves, when Dorothy Kemper settled down beside me with a knowing look that immediately put me on alert. Dorothy was 73, a retired nurse who had moved to Sunset Gardens the same month I did. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything and wasn't afraid to speak her mind, qualities that had made her an excellent nurse and an occasionally uncomfortable friend. Her silver hair was always perfectly styled, and she had a way of cutting through social pleasantries to address whatever issue was really on her mind. "Eleanor," she said without preamble, adjusting her wool cardigan against the afternoon breeze. "We need to talk." I had been expecting this conversation for weeks. Dorothy was observant, and I knew she had noticed the small changes in my lifestyle, the way I'd started skipping the community's restaurant outings, how I always declined when groups went to the local theater, and my recent habit of bringing my own tea bags to the dining room instead of ordering from the cafe menu. "About what?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Dorothy gave me the same look she probably used on patients who weren't being honest about their symptoms. "About whatever's going on that has you living like you're broke when I know perfectly well you have Gerald's pension and life insurance money." I shifted uncomfortably on the bench, watching a young mother push her toddler on the swing set across the courtyard. "I'm just being more careful with money. It's smart financial planning at our age." "Careful is one thing," Dorothy said, her voice gentle but firm. "What you're doing is something else entirely. Eleanor, you've lost weight. You're wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation, and yesterday I saw you counting coupons in the grocery store like you were performing surgery." The accuracy of her observations stung. I had lost about 15 pounds over the past 8 months, partly from stress, but mostly from cutting back on groceries to stretch my budget. And yes, I had become obsessive about coupons and sales, planning my shopping trips with military precision to save every possible dollar. "Times are tight for everyone," I said weakly. Dorothy turned to face me directly. "Eleanor Hartwell, I've known you for over a year, and you're one of the most generous, thoughtful people I've ever met. You've brought flowers to every resident who's been in the hospital. You organized the memorial service for Mrs. Patterson when her family couldn't be bothered to visit, and you've tutored half the staff's children in math for free. This isn't about money being tight. This is about money going somewhere it shouldn't." I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. Dorothy's directness was uncomfortable, but it wasn't unfair. I had indeed been cutting corners everywhere possible, and apparently, it was more obvious than I'd hoped. "I don't know what you mean," I said, but even I could hear the lack of conviction in my voice. Dorothy sighed and pulled her cardigan tighter. "Honey, I spent 40 years watching people make sacrifices for ungrateful family members. Parents who bankrupted themselves paying for their adult children's addictions. Wives who worked 3 jobs while their husbands gambled away their savings. Children who gave up their own futures caring for parents who never appreciated the sacrifice." She paused, watching my reaction carefully. "The pattern is always the same. The giver thinks they're helping, but they're really enabling. And the taker, they start seeing the help as an entitlement, not a gift." Her words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. Over the past few months, I had noticed that Marcus never expressed gratitude for my initial down payment anymore. It had become ancient history, mentioned only in passing, if at all, and neither he nor Vivian had ever asked about repaying the loan they had insisted on treating as temporary assistance. "You don't understand," I said quietly. "Marcus is my only child. He's all I have left of Gerald and our life together. If I don't help him, who will?" Dorothy reached over and touched my hand. "Eleanor, There's a difference between helping someone and allowing them to take advantage of you. And from what I can see, you've crossed that line. That's not what's happening, I protested, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Isn't it? Dorothy's voice remained gentle, but her questions were precise. When was the last time Marcus visited you here? When was the last time he called just to see how you were doing, not because he needed something? When was the last time he noticed that you're struggling? I tried to remember but couldn't come up with satisfying answers to any of her questions. Marcus's visits had become increasingly rare, and our phone conversations had become perfunctory check-ins rather than meaningful exchanges. He's busy, I said defensively. He has a new house, a demanding job, a wife to consider. It's natural for adult children to become more independent. Dorothy nodded slowly. You're right, it is natural. But it's not natural for them to become indifferent to their parents' well-being. Eleanor, when was the last time Marcus asked if you needed anything? When was the last time he offered to help you with something? Anything at all? The questions stung because I couldn't answer them. In fact, not only had Marcus stopped offering help, he had stopped asking about my life in any meaningful way. Our conversations focused entirely on his work, his house, his plans with Vivian, and his various social activities. My life at Sunset. Gardens, my health, my finances, my emotional well-being, none of these topics seem to interest him anymore. Maybe he assumes I'm fine, I said weakly. Or maybe he's gotten so comfortable taking your help that he's forgotten you're a person with your own needs, Dorothy replied. Eleanor, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you giving money to Marcus and Vivian? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I could lie, deflect, or change the subject, but Dorothy's nurse training had taught her to spot evasion from a mile away. It's complicated, I finally admitted. No, it isn't, Dorothy said firmly. Either you're supporting them financially, or you're not. And if you are, that explains everything. The budget constraints, the lifestyle changes, and most importantly, why they feel free to ignore you. They've gotten comfortable knowing that Mom will always be there to bail them out. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, though I couldn't tell if they were from frustration, sadness, or the relief of finally having someone acknowledge what I'd been too afraid to admit to myself. They needed help with the house, I said quietly. I gave them money for the down payment, and then when they had trouble making payments, I couldn't let them lose their home. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. How long have you been making their mortgage payments? Since last October, almost a year now. And they don't know? I shook my head, feeling the full weight of my secret pressing down on me. Dorothy leaned back against the bench, her expression a mixture of sympathy and frustration. Oh, Eleanor, you sweet, foolish woman. You've been enabling them to live beyond their means while you sacrifice your own comfort and security. I'm their mother, I said, the words coming out more like a plea than a statement. This is what mothers do. No, Dorothy said firmly. Mothers help their children become independent, responsible adults. What you're doing is the opposite. You're allowing them to remain children who don't have to face the consequences of their financial choices. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching the families enjoy the beautiful autumn afternoon. Children laughed and played while their parents chatted comfortably, and I found myself wondering when I had stopped feeling like I belonged in scenes of normal family happiness. What should I do? I finally asked. Dorothy turned to look at me with compassion in her eyes. You need to stop the payments, Eleanor, immediately. And you need to tell them the truth about what you've been doing. The thought terrified me. But they'll lose their house. Maybe. Or maybe they'll finally take responsibility for their own lives and find a way to make it work. But either way, it won't be your problem to solve anymore. They'll hate me, I whispered. Dorothy shook her head. If they hate you for stopping financial support they didn't even know they were receiving, then they were never really loving you. Anyway, they were loving what you could do for them. Her words struck me like a physical blow, because somewhere deep down, I suspected she might be right. When had Marcus last told me he loved me? When had he last shown genuine interest in my life or concern for my well-being? When had either he or Vivian treated me like a beloved family member rather than a convenient resource? I need to think about this, I said, though I wasn't sure I had the courage to act on Dorothy's advice. Don't think too long, Dorothy said, standing up and brushing leaves from her coat. Every month you wait is another month of enabling their irresponsibility and depleting your own resources. You deserve better than this, Eleanor. You deserve to be loved and appreciated, not just used. As Dorothy walked away, I remained on the bench, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Her words echoed in my mind, forcing me to confront truths I had been avoiding for months. I knew she was right about everything. I was enabling Marcus and Vivian to live beyond their means while sacrificing my own financial security. I was allowing them to take my generosity for granted and treat me as less important than their social obligations and expensive lifestyle choices. But despite understanding all of this intellectually, I wasn't ready to act on Dorothy's advice. The thought of confronting Marcus and Vivian, of potentially causing them to lose their house, of risking whatever relationship we still had, it all felt too overwhelming, too dangerous. So I made the decision that would define the next 3 years of my life. I would continue the mortgage payments, continue the sacrifices, continue hoping that somehow things would improve on their own. I had no idea that this choice would eventually lead me to the loneliest Christmas of my life, or that Dorothy's warning would prove to be not just accurate, but prophetic. The first snow of December fell on a Tuesday, dusting the grounds of Sunset Gardens with a thin layer of white that reminded me of powdered sugar on one of Gerald's favorite Christmas cookies. I was sitting in the community room, helping organize donated books for the holiday charity drive, when my phone rang with Marcus's name on the display. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, immediately brightening at the unexpected call. Marcus had been even more distant lately, and I hadn't spoken to him in over 2 weeks. "Hey, Mom," he said, and I could hear traffic in the background. "I'm calling because Vivian and I wanted to discuss Christmas plans with you." My heart lifted with anticipation. For 3 years running, I had hosted Christmas dinner in the Sunset Gardens dining room, a tradition that had become one of my favorite parts of the holiday season. The community allowed residents to reserve the main dining room for special occasions, and I had always enjoyed decorating it festively and preparing a traditional Christmas feast for Marcus, Vivian, and occasionally Vivian's parents when they visited from Delaware. "Wonderful," I said, already mentally planning the menu. "Should we do Christmas Eve or Christmas Day this year? I was thinking Christmas Day might be nice. We could have brunch and then open presents afterward." There was a pause on the other end of the line that immediately set my nerves on edge. "Actually, Mom, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. This year is going to be different." I felt my stomach tighten, but tried to keep my voice cheerful. "Different how?" "Well, Vivian's parents are coming up from Wilmington to spend Christmas week with us, and her sister Rebecca is driving over from Pittsburgh with her family, her husband, and their 2 kids. So we're going to host Christmas dinner at our house this year." The words should have made me happy. Marcus and Vivian entertaining family. In their beautiful home, the house I had helped them buy and was still helping them keep. It should have felt like a wonderful development. "That sounds lovely," I said carefully. "What time should I arrive? Should I bring anything special?" Another pause. Longer this time, filled with the distant sound of Marcus's turn signal clicking. "Mom, the thing is, with Vivian's whole family there, the house is going to be pretty crowded. Her parents are staying in the guest room and Rebecca's family is sleeping in the living room on air mattresses. It's going to be chaos, honestly." I waited for him to continue, to extend the invitation despite the crowded conditions. but he seemed to have finished speaking. "I don't mind chaos," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "I love big family gatherings, and I could help Vivian with the cooking. You know how much I enjoy preparing Christmas dinner." "I know you do, Mom, and we really appreciate that. But Vivian has this whole vision for the dinner, you know? She's been planning it for months. She wants to do everything herself, make it really special for her family since they don't get to visit very often." The words hit me like a slap. Vivian's family deserved a special Christmas dinner, but apparently I didn't qualify for the same consideration. "So what are you saying, Marcus?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand exactly what he was saying. "I'm saying maybe this. Year you could spend Christmas at Sunset Gardens? I know they always do something nice for the residents. And then maybe we could see you the day after Christmas, or later in the week when things calm down." I sat in stunned silence, watching the snow fall outside the community room windows while the other residents continued sorting books around me, oblivious to the fact that my world was collapsing. "You're not inviting me to Christmas dinner," I said, needing to hear the words spoken clearly. "It's not that we don't want you there, Mom. It's just that this year, with Vivian's family visiting, it makes more sense for it to be just them." "Just them," I repeated. "And what am I, Marcus? Am I not family?" "Of course you're family," he said quickly, his voice taking on the defensive tone I remembered from his teenage years when he'd been caught doing something wrong. "You're my mother. But this is Vivian's first time hosting her whole family for Christmas, and she's really nervous about it. She wants everything to be perfect." I closed my eyes, trying to process what I was hearing. For over 3 years, I had been secretly paying their mortgage, $2,200 every month, money that represented more than half my income. I had cut back on everything, denied myself basic comforts, and depleted my savings to ensure they could live in their dream house. And now they were telling me I wasn't welcome at their Christmas table because Vivian wanted everything to be perfect for her family. "I see," I said, my voice steady despite the tears that were starting to blur my vision. "And when exactly were you planning to see me during the holidays?" "Well, like I said, maybe December 26th? We could do lunch somewhere, just the 3 of us. Or maybe New Year's Day. We could start a new tradition. Lunch somewhere. Not at their house, not as part of their holiday celebration, but squeezed in as an afterthought between their real festivities and their return to normal life." "Marcus," I said quietly, "do you remember when you were 8 years old and had pneumonia right before Christmas?" Yeah, I think so. Why?" "Your father and I had planned to spend Christmas with his brother's family in Scranton. 20 people, a big traditional dinner, all the cousins together. But when you got sick, we canceled our plans without hesitation. Do you know why?" Marcus was quiet, probably wondering where I was going with this story. "Because family means you don't get left behind when someone gets sick, or when plans change, or when space is tight. Family means you make room, even when it's inconvenient." "Mom, this isn't the same thing, isn't it?" I interrupted, my voice rising slightly despite my efforts to stay calm. "Marcus, I am 70 years old. I have spent every Christmas since your father died either alone or with the 2 of you. I have no other children, no grandchildren, no extended family in the area. Christmas with you and Vivian is the only real family celebration I have." "I know that, but no, you don't know that," I said firmly. If you knew that, you wouldn't be telling me to spend Christmas alone at an assisted living facility while you celebrate with Vivian's family in the house that I helped you buy." The words hung in the air, and I immediately regretted letting that last detail slip out. I had promised myself I would never use my financial contribution as emotional leverage, but the hurt and disbelief had overwhelmed my better judgment. "What do you mean the house you helped us buy?" Marcus asked, his tone shifting to confusion. I realized I had opened a door I wasn't prepared to walk through. "I meant the down payment, obviously, the $45,000. "Right, the loan?" Marcus said slowly, which we're planning to start paying back next year when my promotion comes through. Next year. Always next year. The promotion that may or may not happen. The financial improvement that was perpetually just around the corner. The repayment plan that existed only in theory. Of course, I said, my voice flat with exhaustion. Next year? Mom, are you okay? You sound upset. The question was so absurd that I almost laughed. Was I okay? I was a 70-year-old widow who had just been told she wasn't welcome at her only child's Christmas dinner, who had been secretly paying their mortgage for over 2 years while living on rice and beans to make ends meet, who had apparently become so irrelevant to their lives that her absence from their holiday celebration wouldn't even be noticed. I'm fine, Marcus, I said. I hope you and Vivian have a lovely Christmas with her family. We could do Christmas Eve together, he offered suddenly, as if the idea had just occurred to him. Maybe dinner at that Italian place you like? Christmas Eve dinner at a restaurant, while they prepared for their real Christmas celebration the next day with the people who actually mattered to them. That's very kind, I said, but I think I'll probably be busy with activities here at Sunset Gardens. It was a lie. The community center planned a small Christmas Eve service and cookie exchange, but nothing that would prevent me from having dinner with my son if he genuinely wanted to spend time with me. But something inside me had shifted during this conversation, and I no longer wanted to accept the scraps of attention he was offering out of guilt. Are you sure? We could make it special. I'm sure, I said. You focus on Vivian's family. I'll be fine. After we hung up, I sat in the community room for a long time, watching the snow fall more heavily outside. Other residents moved around me, chatting about their own holiday plans, their visiting children and grandchildren, their excitement about the upcoming celebrations. For the first time in 3 years of secret mortgage payments, I allowed myself to truly acknowledge what Dorothy had tried to tell me months earlier. I wasn't helping Marcus and Vivian. I was enabling them to live beyond their means while they systematically excluded me from their lives. They had gotten so comfortable taking my financial support that they no longer felt any obligation to include me in their actual family life. That evening, I called Dorothy and told her about the Christmas conversation. She listened without interrupting, then sighed deeply. Eleanor, now do you see what I was trying to tell you? They're treating you like a bank, not like family. And banks don't get invited to Christmas dinner. Her words stung because they were so accurate. I had become nothing more than a financial institution to them, reliable, unquestioning, and ultimately invisible. What should I do? I asked, though I suspected I already knew her answer. Stop the payments, Dorothy said firmly. Stop enabling them to treat you this way. And stop pretending that what you're doing is helping them when it's really just allowing them to avoid growing up. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Dorothy was right, but I also realized that I still wasn't ready to take her advice. Despite everything, despite the hurt and the exclusion and the growing evidence that they took me completely for granted, I couldn't bring myself to risk losing Marcus entirely. So I would continue the payments, continue the sacrifice, continue hoping that somehow things would change. I had no idea that this Christmas exclusion was only the beginning, or that in less than 2 weeks, I would finally reach the breaking point that would change everything forever. Christmas Eve arrived gray and cold, with the kind of bone-deep chill that made even the heated hallways of Sunset Gardens feel drafty. I had spent the morning helping with the community's cookie exchange, forcing smiles and making small talk with my neighbors as they shared stories about their children and grandchildren arriving for the holidays. By afternoon, I was emotionally exhausted from pretending to be cheerful, while my heart felt like it was breaking. I was in my apartment, debating whether to attend the evening Christmas service in the community room, when my phone rang. The caller, ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something compelled me to answer. Mrs. Hartwell? This is Janet Morrison. I'm a neighbor of your son Marcus in Willowbrook Estates. My stomach immediately tightened. Neighbors didn't call out of the blue on Christmas Eve unless something was wrong. Is everything all right? I asked, already imagining accidents, emergencies, trips to the hospital. Oh yes, everyone's fine, Janet said quickly. I'm actually calling because I wanted to thank you personally for the most wonderful Christmas gift. I was completely confused. I'm sorry, what gift? The beautiful poinsettia arrangement you sent? It was delivered this morning with a card that said it was from Marcus Hartwell's mother. It's absolutely gorgeous. I've never seen such an elaborate arrangement. The delivery man said it cost over $200. I sank into my armchair, feeling dizzy. I'm sorry, Mrs. Morrison, but I think there's been some mistake. I didn't send you any flowers. There was a pause on the other end. Oh, well, that's strange. The card definitely said it was from you. Maybe your son arranged it. As a surprise, maybe my son had arranged it. Using money I was secretly providing to pay their mortgage, Marcus or Vivian had apparently been sending expensive gifts to their neighbors and claiming they were from me. Mrs. Morrison, I said carefully, may I ask how you know Marcus and Vivian? Oh, we've become quite close over the past year. They're such a lovely young couple. Vivian invited my husband and me to their Christmas dinner tonight. Such a beautiful home they have. I was actually calling to ask if you'd be there so I could thank you in person for the flowers. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not only had I been excluded from Christmas dinner, but neighbors, virtual strangers, had been invited to take my place at the table in the house I was paying for. I won't be attending, I managed to say. I have other plans. Oh, what a shame. Well, I'll be sure to thank Marcus and Vivian for facilitating such a thoughtful gift. You raised a wonderful son, Mrs. Hartwell. After I hung up, I sat staring at my phone, trying to process what I had just learned. Marcus and Vivian were hosting Christmas dinner for Vivian's family and their neighbors, sending expensive gifts to those neighbors using my name, and I, the person actually paying for their lifestyle, had been told there wasn't room for me at their table. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Betty Chen, another Willowbrook Estates resident. Eleanor? This is Betty Chen. We met at Marcus and Vivian's housewarming party last year. I wanted to call and thank you for the lovely Christmas wine gift basket that was delivered. Today! My hands began to shake. Another gift? Yes, it's beautiful. Champagne, chocolate, gourmet crackers. It must have cost a fortune. The card said it was from Marcus's mother, Eleanor Hartwell. I'm so looking forward to seeing you at dinner tonight. I closed my eyes, feeling nauseous. Mrs. Chen, I won't be attending the dinner. Really? But Marcus and Vivian have been talking about you all week, telling everyone how excited they are to have family visiting for the holidays. Vivian's parents seem lovely, and she mentioned her sister's children are absolutely adorable. Family, visiting for the holidays. Everyone except the person who was actually family. I hope you enjoy the evening, I said, ending the call as quickly as I could. Over the next hour, I received 3 more calls from Willowbrook Estates neighbors, all thanking me for expensive Christmas gifts that had been delivered with cards claiming they were from me. A fruit and cheese basket worth $150, a case of premium wine valued at $300, a gourmet food hamper that one neighbor estimated cost at least $250. As I calculated the total, over $1,000 in gifts sent to neighbors using my name. I realized that Marcus and Vivian were not only excluding me from their Christmas celebration, but actively using my identity to enhance their social standing in their upscale neighborhood. They were literally taking credit for generosity they weren't providing while denying me the one thing I actually wanted, a place at their family table. The final call came just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across my small apartment. Hartwell, this is Patricia Fleming from across the street. I just had to call and tell you how touched I am by the beautiful Christmas ornament collection you sent. How much did it cost? I asked, my voice flat with exhaustion and anger. "Oh, I couldn't say exactly, but it's clearly from an expensive specialty shop. Each ornament is hand-blown glass, and the box said it was a limited edition set. I'd guess at least $400? $1,400. They had spent $1,400 of money I was providing to buy gifts for their neighbors, using my name to take credit for the generosity, while telling me I wasn't welcome at their Christmas dinner because there wasn't enough room. "Mrs. Fleming," I said, "are you attending Marcus and Vivian's Christmas dinner tonight?" "Yes." "We're all so excited. It's going to be quite the gathering. Vivian's family, plus about 6 couples from the neighborhood. She's been cooking for days. She even hired a catering service to help with some of the dishes." A catering service? They had hired professional caterers for their Christmas dinner, while telling me they couldn't afford to include one more person at their table. After I hung up, I sat in my armchair watching the darkness settle over Maplewood Heights, trying to process the full scope of what I had discovered. For over 2 years, I had been secretly paying their mortgage, sacrificing my own comfort and financial security to ensure they could live in their dream house. During that time, they had systematically excluded me from their lives, treated me as an inconvenience, and now were literally using my name and implied generosity to impress their neighbors while denying me a place at their Christmas table. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I wondered if I had ever really known my son at all. This wasn't just taking me for granted. This was actively exploiting my generosity while treating me with contempt. I thought about all the times I had eaten rice and beans for dinner to stretch my grocery budget. All the medical appointments I had postponed because I couldn't afford the copays. All the social activities at Sunset Gardens I had declined because I didn't have money for the fees. I had denied myself basic comforts and necessities so that Marcus and Vivian could live beyond their means, send expensive gifts to neighbors, hire caterers, and host elaborate dinner parties for people who were virtual strangers. As I sat in the growing darkness, I realized that Dorothy had been right about everything. I wasn't helping Marcus and Vivian. I was enabling them to be irresponsible and ungrateful. I wasn't being a good mother. I was being a doormat. And they weren't treating me like family. They were treating me like a resource to be exploited and then discarded when I was no longer convenient. At 7 o'clock, I walked to my kitchen counter where I kept important phone numbers written on a small notepad. I found the number for First National Bank's customer service line and dialed it, knowing that even though it was Christmas Eve, they had a 24-hour automated system for account management. After navigating through the menu options, I reached the section for automatic payment management. With hands that were surprisingly steady, I followed the prompts to cancel the automatic transfer that had been sending $2,200 from my account to Marcus and Vivian's mortgage company every month for over 2 years. "Your automatic payment has been successfully canceled," the computerized voice confirmed. "No further transfers will be processed." I hung up the phone and sat back down in my armchair, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: the profound relief of finally standing up for myself. Tomorrow, Marcus and Vivian would wake up in their beautiful house, surrounded by Vivian's family and their impressed neighbors, believing they had successfully navigated another Christmas season. They would have no idea that their mother and mother-in-law had finally reached her breaking point, or that the financial support they had taken for granted was about to disappear forever. For the first time in over 2 years, I went to bed on Christmas Eve, knowing that I had finally chosen my own dignity over their convenience. It was the best Christmas gift I had given myself in years. Christmas morning arrived with brilliant sunshine that seemed to mock the darkness I felt inside. I woke before dawn, my mind immediately returning to the phone call I had made the night before. The automatic payment cancellation felt both liberating and terrifying, like jumping off a cliff without knowing what lay below. I made coffee with shaking hands and sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the phone number I had memorized, but never used: Dorothy's direct line. It was too early to call anyone, but I needed to hear a voice of reason, someone who could help me understand if I had done the right thing or if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. I tried to distract myself by watching the Christmas service on television, but every hymn and prayer seemed to emphasize family, forgiveness, and love. Concepts that felt complicated and painful given what I had discovered about my own family situation. At 9:30, I finally called Dorothy. "Eleanor," she answered on the second ring, her voice immediately alert despite the early hour. "Are you all right? You sound terrible." "Dorothy, I need to tell you what happened yesterday, and I need you to tell me honestly if I've made a terrible mistake." I told her everything. The phone calls from the neighbors, the expensive gifts sent using my name, the catered Christmas dinner I had been excluded from, and finally my decision to cancel the mortgage payments. Dorothy listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of outrage or sympathy. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Eleanor Hartwell," she finally said, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and sadness, "you have done exactly what you should have done. What took you so long?" Her approval should have made me feel better, but instead, I started crying. Not the gentle tears of sadness, but the ugly, body-shaking sobs of someone who had been holding back grief and anger for far too long. "But what if they lose their house?" I managed to say between sobs. "What if Marcus never speaks to me again? What if I've destroyed the only family relationship I have left?" "Oh, honey," Dorothy's voice was gentle but firm. "Listen to me carefully. If Marcus stops speaking to you because you can no longer afford to subsidize his lifestyle, then he was never really speaking to you anyway. He was speaking to your bank account." Her words cut deep because they echoed the fears I had been suppressing. For months, when had Marcus last called just to see how I was doing? When had he last shown genuine interest in my life, my health, my happiness? When had either he or Vivian treated me like a person they loved rather than a resource they could exploit? "Keep thinking about when he was little," I said, wiping my eyes with a tissue. "He was such a sweet child, Dorothy. So gentle and kind. He would bring me dandelions from the yard and tell me they were more beautiful than roses because they were free gifts from nature." "Children change," Dorothy said sadly. "Sometimes they become better versions of themselves, and sometimes they become people we don't recognize. That doesn't mean we stop loving them, but it also doesn't mean we have to enable their worst impulses." I spent the rest of Christmas morning on the phone with Dorothy, who helped me work through the emotional complexity of what I had done. She reminded me of all the sacrifices I had made, the meals I had skipped, the medical care I had postponed, the social activities I had declined, while Marcus and Vivian lived extravagantly and excluded me from their lives. "You've been grieving." "For years," Dorothy said as our conversation was winding down. "Grieving for the relationship you thought you had with Marcus. Grieving for the gratitude you expected. Grieving for the family connection you were trying to buy. Yesterday, you finally stopped grieving and started living. That afternoon, I attended the Christmas dinner in the Sunset Gardens dining room. The community center had decorated beautifully, with white linens, red poinsettias, and soft jazz music playing in the background. About 30 residents gathered for a traditional meal, sharing stories about their families and their Christmas memories. I found myself sitting next to Harold Brennan, an 82-year-old retired accountant whose daughter lived in California and rarely visited. We compared notes about long-distance children and discovered we had more in common than either of us had expected. "The hardest part," Harold said as we shared apple pie for dessert, "is accepting that your children's lives don't revolve around you anymore. My daughter Sarah calls once a month, sends a card on my birthday, and visits every other Christmas. For years, I was hurt that she didn't need me more. Then I realized that raising her to be independent and successful meant she wouldn't need me to be happy." I thought about his words as I walked back to my apartment that evening. Had I raised Marcus to be independent, Or had I raised him to expect that his problems would always be solved by someone else? Had I been helping him build a life? Or had I been enabling him to avoid taking responsibility for his choices? That night, I called my sister Margaret in Maryland, something I rarely did because long-distance calls felt like an unnecessary expense given my tight budget. "Eleanor!" Margaret sounded delighted to hear from me. "Merry Christmas! How was dinner with Marcus and Vivian?" I found myself telling Margaret the whole story: the excluded Christmas dinner, the gifts sent using my name, the secret mortgage, payments, and my decision to finally stop enabling their irresponsible behavior. Margaret listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she was quiet for several minutes. "Eleanor," she finally said, "I have to tell you something I probably should have said years ago. When you moved to that senior community after Gerald died, James and I talked about inviting you to come live with us here in Maryland. My brother-in-law James had always been kind to me, but I was surprised to learn they had considered such an offer. We decided not to because we knew you wanted to stay close to Marcus," Margaret continued. "But honestly, Eleanor, even then we could see that he was taking advantage of your generosity. The way he would let you pay for dinners when you visited, the way he never seemed concerned about your finances after Gerald died, it worried us." I felt a stab of embarrassment. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you seemed determined to maintain that relationship at any cost. And we didn't want to be the interfering relatives who criticized your son. But Eleanor, the invitation is still open. You could sell your place at Sunset Gardens and come live with us. We have a beautiful guest house and you could have your independence while still having family nearby." The offer was tempting, but it also felt like running away from the problem rather than facing it. "Let me think about it," I said. "Right now, I need to see how this situation with Marcus resolves itself." "Of course. But remember, Eleanor, you have choices. You don't have to live in isolation, and you don't have to bankrupt yourself to maintain a relationship with people who don't appreciate your sacrifices." After I hung up, I sat in my apartment thinking about choices. For over 2 years, I had felt trapped in a situation where my only options were to keep paying Marcus's mortgage or risk losing him entirely. But Margaret's call reminded me that I had other possibilities, other paths forward that didn't involve financial sacrifice or emotional manipulation. I thought about Harold's daughter Sarah, who lived her own life but still maintained a loving relationship with her father within appropriate boundaries. I thought about the other residents at Sunset Gardens who had children who visited regularly, called frequently, and treated their parents with respect and gratitude. Most importantly, I thought about the woman I had been before Gerald died. Confident, independent, respected by my students and colleagues, secure in my own worth. Somewhere along the way, I had lost that woman in my desperate attempt to maintain a connection with my son. But canceling those mortgage payments felt like the first step toward finding her again. As I prepared for bed that Christmas night, I realized that I felt lighter than I had in years, not because my problems were solved, but because I had finally stopped creating new ones. I had no idea what would happen when Marcus discovered that the mortgage payments had stopped, but for the first time in a long time, I was more interested in protecting my own dignity than in managing his reactions. Tomorrow, I would begin the difficult work of rebuilding my life on my own terms. But tonight, I would sleep peacefully, knowing that I had finally chosen myself over the people who had taken my love for granted. The call came on January 15th, 3 weeks after I had canceled the mortgage payments. I was in the Sunset Gardens community room, helping organize the New Year's resolution support group, when my phone buzzed with Marcus's number. I had been expecting this call, dreading it and anticipating it in equal measure. "Mom?" Marcus's voice sounded strained and confused. "I need to talk to you about something. Can I come over right now?" "Of course," I said, my heart pounding despite the calm in my voice. "I'll be here." I excused myself from the group and went to my apartment to wait. Through my window, I could see the bare branches of the oak tree Gerald and I had planted in, Our backyard 40 years ago, now visible from my new home across town. Somehow, the sight of that tree, still standing, still growing despite being transplanted, gave me strength. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, and I could see the stress etched in every line of his face. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "Mom, something's wrong with your bank account," he said without preamble as he sat heavily on my small sofa. "First National called me yesterday. They said our mortgage payment was returned for insufficient funds, but that doesn't make sense because the payment comes from your account automatically." I poured him a glass of water and sat across from him in my armchair, the same chair where I had made the decision to cancel the payments 3 weeks earlier. "There's nothing wrong with my bank account, Marcus," I said quietly. "I canceled the automatic payment." He stared at me for several seconds, as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "You what?" "I canceled the automatic payment to your mortgage company." On Christmas Eve. Marcus leaned forward, his face a mixture of confusion and panic. "But why? Did something happen with the bank? Is there some kind of technical problem we need to fix?" I looked at my son, this man I had raised from infancy, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose homework I had helped with, whose dreams I had supported with my own money, and realized he genuinely didn't understand why I would stop paying for his house. "Marcus," I said gently, "did you know that I've been making your mortgage payments for over 2 years?" "What do you mean?" His brow furrowed. "You helped with the down payment, but we've been making the monthly payments ourselves." The innocence in his voice was almost heartbreaking. He truly believed he had been paying his own mortgage all this time. "No, sweetheart. When you missed those first payments in October 2021, the bank called me because I was listed as a reference. I started making the payments then, and I've been making them ever since. $2,200 every month for 27 months. Marcus's face went white. That's almost $60,000. $59,400, to be exact." He sat in stunned silence, and I could practically see him recalculating the last 2 years of his life, understanding for the first time how he and Vivian had been able to afford their lifestyle. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked. "Because I was afraid," I admitted. "Afraid that if you knew I was helping, Vivian would see it as interference. Afraid that you would feel guilty or resentful. Afraid that you would make me choose between helping you and maintaining our relationship." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of stress I remembered from his childhood. "Mom, I don't understand. If you've been helping us all this time, why stop now? Is it a money problem? Because I'm supposed to get that promotion in March and we could start paying you back." "Marcus," I interrupted gently, "when was the last time you invited me to your house?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "What does that have to do with anything?" "When was the last time you included me in your holiday plans? When was the last time you asked how I was doing financially or whether I needed help with anything?" He shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. "Mom, you know we've been busy with the house and work and everything. I know you sent expensive Christmas gifts to your neighbors using my name while telling me there wasn't room for me at your Christmas dinner." Marcus's face flushed red. "How did you know about that?" "Because your neighbors called to thank me. 5 different neighbors, Marcus. Over $1,400 in gifts that I supposedly sent, while I spent Christmas alone because you said Vivian's family was more important." "That wasn't what I said." "That's exactly what you said," I replied firmly. "You said there wasn't room for me because Vivian wanted everything to be perfect for her family. Meanwhile, you invited neighbors I barely know and hired caterers to serve them dinner in the house I've been paying for." Marcus stood up and started pacing my small living room. "You don't understand the pressure we've been under. Vivian's been working toward a promotion, and networking with the neighbors is important for our social standing in the community." "And where do I fit into your social standing, Marcus? Am I an embarrassment?" Am I too old, too unfashionable, too inconvenient for your new life in Willowbrook Estates? Of course not. But his protest sounded hollow, and we both knew it. I stood up and walked to my kitchen counter, where I kept a folder with bank statements and financial records. I pulled out a sheet of paper I had prepared the night before and handed it to Marcus. "This is a summary of every payment I've made on your behalf," I said. "The initial down payment of $45,000 plus 27 months of mortgage payments totaling $59,400. That's $104,400, Marcus. More than half of everything your father left me." Marcus stared at the paper, his hands shaking slightly. "I had no idea, Mom. I swear I thought we were managing the payments ourselves." "How?" I asked simply. "How did you think you were affording a $2,200 mortgage payment on your salaries while also taking vacations, buying new furniture, sending expensive gifts, and hiring caterers for dinner parties?" He had no answer, because there was no reasonable answer. He and Vivian had been living in a financial fantasy, spending money they didn't have while someone else quietly covered their obligations. "What does Vivian think about all this?" I asked. Marcus's silence told me everything I needed to know. She doesn't know, does she? "Even now you haven't told her that I've been paying your mortgage." "I wanted to talk to you first," he said weakly, "to understand what happened." "What happened, Marcus, is that I finally realized I was enabling you to live beyond your means while you systematically excluded me from your lives. What happened is that I got tired of eating rice and beans for dinner so you could hire caterers. What happened is that I decided to stop being a doormat." The words hung in the air between us, and I saw something shift in Marcus's expression. A recognition that this conversation was not going according to his expectations. "You can't just stop the payments," he said, his voice taking on a note of desperation. "We'll lose the house, everything we've worked for." "Everything I've paid for," I corrected. "And yes, you might lose the house. Or you might finally take responsibility for your own lives and find a way to afford it without my help." "But Mom—" "No, Marcus." I held up my hand to stop him. "I've made my decision. I will not resume the mortgage payments. I will not continue subsidizing a lifestyle you can't afford while being treated like an inconvenience in my own son's life." Marcus stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Perhaps he was. For over 2 years, he had seen me as a reliable source of financial support that required no maintenance or gratitude. Now he was seeing me as a person with feelings, boundaries, and self-respect. "What am I supposed to tell Vivian?" he asked. "The truth," I replied. "That your mother has been secretly paying your mortgage for over 2 years, and that she's decided to stop. That you and Vivian need to figure out how to live within your actual means instead of the means I've been providing." As Marcus left my apartment that afternoon, I knew I had crossed a bridge that could never be uncrossed. I had finally chosen my own dignity over his comfort, my own needs over his expectations. Whatever happened next, whether he found a way to keep the house or lost it, whether our relationship survived or didn't, I would face it as Eleanor Hartwell, not as a secret benefactor or invisible ATM. For the first time in over 2 years, I was finally free. The silence that followed Marcus's visit stretched on for 2 weeks. No phone calls, no text messages, no contact of any kind. I found myself checking my phone compulsively, not because I was hoping for communication, but because the complete absence of it felt somehow ominous. For over 30 years, Marcus and I had never gone more than a few days without speaking, even during his teenage rebellion phase. Dorothy noticed my distraction during our weekly coffee meeting at the Sunset Gardens Cafe. "You're waiting for the other shoe to drop," she observed, stirring honey into her tea. "But Eleanor, you've already weathered the storm. Whatever happens next is their problem to solve, not yours." She was right, but knowing that intellectually didn't make the waiting any easier. I had spent so many years managing Marcus's problems that stepping back felt unnatural, like learning to walk again after an injury. The first sign of what was happening came from an unexpected source. Janet Morrison, the neighbor who had called to thank me for the Christmas poinsettia, phoned on a Tuesday morning in early February. "Mrs. Hartwell, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to check on you. Is everything all right with Marcus and Vivian?" My heart rate immediately accelerated. "What do you mean?" "Well, there was quite a commotion at their house yesterday evening. Vivian was on the front lawn, shouting at Marcus about something. I couldn't hear everything, but I did hear her mention foreclosure and lies. Then she drove away in her car, tires screeching. Marcus has been sitting on their front porch since then, and frankly, he looks terrible." I thanked Janet for calling and hung up, my mind racing. Apparently, Marcus had finally told Vivian the truth about the mortgage payments, and she had not taken the news well. 3 days later, Marcus called. His voice was hoarse and exhausted. "Mom, can we talk? I need to tell you what's been happening." This time, I suggested meeting at Romano's Italian restaurant, the same place where we had celebrated buying the house. I needed to be on neutral ground for whatever conversation was coming. Marcus was already seated when I arrived, and Janet Morrison had been right. He looked terrible. His hair was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, and he had the hollow-eyed appearance of someone who hadn't been sleeping or eating properly. "Vivian left me," he said without preamble as I sat down across from him. "She moved back to her parents' house in Wilmington." I felt a complicated mixture of sadness for my son and relief that the truth was finally out in the open. "When did you tell her about the mortgage payments?" "The day after I talked to you." She didn't believe me at first. She went through all. Our bank statements, called First National, even looked up our payment history online. When she realized it was true, that we'd been living on your money for over 2 years without knowing it. He trailed off, staring at his untouched coffee. "What did she say?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "She said I was pathetic, that she married a man, not a child who needed his mommy to pay his bills. She said she felt humiliated, that all their friends would find out we'd been living a lie. And what did you say?" What could I say? She was right. I am 38 years old, and I've been letting my mother pay my mortgage without even knowing it. I've been living in a house I can't afford, sending gifts with money I don't have, hosting dinner parties with food I can't pay for. This was the most honest self-assessment I had heard from Marcus in years, possibly ever. "The bank called yesterday," he continued. "We're now 60 days behind on the mortgage. They're starting foreclosure proceedings. Vivian says if I can't figure out how to keep the house without your help, she won't come back." I reached across the table and touched his hand. "Marcus, what do you want to do? Not what Vivian wants? Not what you think you should do? But what do you actually want?" He was quiet for a long time, stirring his coffee and staring out the restaurant window at the gray February afternoon. "I want to stop pretending," he finally said. "I want to stop living beyond my means and lying to myself about it. I want to stop being the kind of person who takes advantage of his mother's generosity and then excludes her from Christmas dinner." The admission seemed to cost him considerable effort, but it also seemed genuine. "So what are you going to do?" "I'm putting the house on the market. Even if I could somehow catch up on the mortgage payments, I can't afford the monthly payments on my own. I've been living in denial about that for 3 years." I felt a wave of relief so strong it surprised me. "Where will you live?" "I found a small apartment in Riverside near my work. It's nothing fancy. 1 bedroom, basic kitchen, no fancy appliances or granite countertops. But it's something I can actually afford on my salary." "And Vivian?" Marcus's expression grew sad, but also clearer than I had seen it in years. "Vivian doesn't want a man who lives in a 1-bedroom apartment. She wants the lifestyle we had in Willowbrook Estates, but she wants it to be real this time. She's talking about dating her boss at the medical center. He's divorced, makes good money, owns a house in the suburbs. How do you feel about that?" "Honestly?" "Relieved. I've been trying to be someone I'm not for so long that I forgot who I actually am. I'm not a man who can afford expensive houses and elaborate dinner parties. I'm not someone who belongs in Willowbrook Estates. I'm a traveling salesman who likes simple things and quiet evenings. We talked for 2 more hours, the longest and most honest conversation we had shared in years. Marcus told me about the financial pressure he had been under, the constant stress of trying to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford, and the growing distance he had felt from me as he became more ashamed of needing help. I kept meaning to call you more, to visit more, but every time I thought about seeing you, I felt guilty. Guilty about the money you had given us, guilty about not paying you back, guilty about living so well while knowing you were making sacrifices. It was easier to just avoid dealing with it. His explanation didn't excuse the way he had treated me, but it helped me understand how we had drifted so far apart. "Mom, I need to ask you something," he said as we prepared to leave. "Can you ever forgive me for taking advantage of your generosity, for treating you like you didn't matter while you were secretly supporting my entire lifestyle?" I looked at my son, this flawed, weak, but ultimately decent man who had finally found the courage to face the truth about his situation, and felt the anger I had been carrying for months begin to dissolve. "I can forgive you, Marcus. But more importantly, I need you to forgive yourself and learn from this experience." The house sold 6 weeks later, just before the foreclosure proceedings would have begun. Marcus and Vivian split the small amount of equity that remained after paying off the mortgage and closing costs. Vivian used her portion as a down payment on a condominium she bought with her new boyfriend. Marcus used his to pay the first year's rent on his apartment and buy basic furniture. For the first time in over 3 years, I didn't receive any phone calls from Marcus asking for financial help. Instead, he called every Sunday evening just to talk, the way he used to before the house became the center of his life. During one of those calls in late March, he said something that surprised me. "Mom, I want you to know that losing the house was the best thing that ever happened to me. For the first time since I got married, I'm living within my means. I'm not stressed about money every day. I'm not pretending to be someone I'm not. And most importantly, I'm not taking advantage of people who love me." As I hung up the phone that evening, I realized that by finally standing up for myself, I had not only saved my own dignity, I had also saved my son from a life built on lies and financial dependence. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst impulses and force them to face the truth about their choices. It had taken me far too long to learn that lesson, but I had finally learned it. 1 year later, I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment in Silver Springs, Maryland, preparing Christmas dinner for a table that would seat 8 people. The aroma of roasting turkey filled the air, and through the window, I could see the Chesapeake Bay stretching toward the horizon, its waters gray-blue under the December sky. Margaret bustled around me, arranging rolls in a basket and stealing tastes of my cranberry sauce, just as we had done as children helping our mother prepare holiday meals 60 years ago. "Eleanor, this stuffing smells exactly like Mom's," she said, lifting the lid on the ceramic dish. "I haven't had homemade stuffing this good in decades." I smiled, feeling more content than I had in years. Gerald's recipe, actually. He was the cook in our family, not me. I'm still learning some of his techniques. The decision to move to Maryland had not been impulsive. After Marcus sold the house and our relationship began to heal, I realized that staying in Maplewood Heights served no real purpose except maintaining proximity to memories that had become more painful than comforting. Margaret's invitation to share her guest house had begun to seem less like charity and more like an opportunity for a fresh start. "Are you sure Marcus won't mind spending Christmas here instead of with you in Pennsylvania?" Margaret asked, checking her watch. "He should be arriving soon." "He was the one who suggested it," I said, adjusting the timer on the oven. "He said it was time for him to travel to see me for a change, instead of always expecting me to accommodate his schedule." The I Transformation in my relationship with Marcus had been gradual but profound. Without the stress of financial overextension and the secret guilt of accepting help he didn't understand, he had become more present, more genuine, more like the man I had hoped he would grow up to be. Our weekly phone calls had evolved from perfunctory check-ins to real conversations about books, work, memories of his father, and plans for the future. More importantly, he had begun treating me like a person whose life mattered, whose needs were worth considering, whose company was valued for itself rather than for what financial support might come with it. The doorbell rang, and Margaret went to answer it while I checked the sweet potatoes. I heard Marcus's voice in the hallway, warm and excited, followed by unfamiliar laughter. "Mom?" Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, his arms open for a hug. He looked healthier than he had in years, relaxed, well-rested, and genuinely happy. "The place looks amazing, and something smells incredible." Behind him stood a woman I didn't recognize, petite with graying brown hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She was holding a covered dish and smiling warmly. "Mom, I'd like you to meet Sarah Kellerman," Marcus said, his arm around the woman's shoulders. "Sarah, this is my mother, Eleanor." Sarah stepped forward and shook my hand, firmly. "Mrs. Hartwell, I've heard so much about you. Marcus talks about you constantly. Your teaching career, your book club, your move to Maryland. I feel like I already know you." I looked at my son, who was beaming with the kind of happiness I hadn't seen on his face since he was a child. "Sarah is a librarian at the Riverside Public Library," Marcus explained. "We met 6 months ago when I was looking for books about financial planning. She was helping me learn to create a real budget." "I brought my famous green bean casserole," Sarah said, lifting her dish. "Marcus mentioned you were making his father's stuffing recipe, and I thought this might complement it nicely." As we gathered around the dinner table an hour later, I looked at the faces surrounding me and marveled at how much my life had changed in 12 months. Margaret and her husband James sat at one end of the table, their daughter Carol and her teenage son visiting from Baltimore. At the other end, Marcus and Sarah were engaged in animated conversation with Carol about library science programs. For the first time in years, I was hosting a Christmas dinner where I felt valued as a person, rather than as a provider. No one at this table was there because they felt obligated or because they needed something from me. They were here because they wanted to be here, because they enjoyed my company, because they considered me worth spending a holiday with. "Eleanor," James said, raising his wine glass, "I'd like to propose a toast to new beginnings, fresh starts, and the courage to change course when the path we're on isn't serving us anymore." As we clinked glasses around the table, I caught Marcus's eye. He smiled at me with a warmth and gratitude that I hadn't seen in years, and I realized that by saving myself, I had also saved him. After dinner, while the others played board games, in the living room, Marcus and I walked along the waterfront path behind Margaret's property. The air was crisp but not bitter, and the last light of the winter sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Mom, I want to tell you something," Marcus said as we paused at a bench overlooking the bay. "Last Christmas, when you canceled the mortgage payments, I thought you were being cruel. I thought you were punishing me for excluding you from dinner." I started to respond, but he held up his hand. "I need to finish this. It took me months to understand that you weren't being cruel. You were being brave. You were saving both of us from a relationship built on lies and financial dependency. You were forcing me to grow up and take responsibility for my own life." He paused, watching a pair of seagulls circle over the water. "I've been seeing a therapist since the divorce was finalized," he continued. "She helped me understand that I had spent my entire adult life trying to avoid the discomfort of facing my limitations. Instead of living within my means and building a life I could actually sustain, I kept looking for external solutions. First your down payment, then your secret mortgage payments, always something to avoid dealing with reality. And now?" I asked gently. "Now I live in a small apartment that I can afford, I drive a used car that's paid off, and I'm dating a woman who loves me for who I actually am, not for the lifestyle I can pretend to provide. I'm happier than I've been in years. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the sunset over the Chesapeake Bay. I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment, the years of silent sacrifice, the gradual exclusion from Marcus's life, the devastating Christmas Eve realization, and finally, the terrifying but necessary decision to choose my own dignity over his comfort. "Marcus," I said finally, "do you remember what your father used to say about the difference between helping and enabling?" Marcus smiled. He said helping someone teaches them to fly, but enabling someone clips their wings and convinces them they need to stay on the ground. "I spent 3 years clipping your wings because I was afraid that if you learned to fly, you might fly away from me. But the truth is, you couldn't really fly toward me either, because you were carrying the weight of a life you couldn't sustain." As we walked back toward the house, where warm light spilled from the windows and the sound of laughter drifted across the evening air, I reflected on the lessons I had learned during this difficult year. I had learned that love without boundaries becomes enabling, that generosity without limits becomes exploitation, that maintaining relationships through financial support rather than genuine connection ultimately damages everyone involved. Most importantly, I had learned that at 70 years old, it was not too late to reclaim my dignity, rebuild my life, and establish relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. The woman who had sat alone in her apartment that Christmas Eve, contemplating a phone call to the mortgage company, had been afraid and desperate and convinced she had no choices. The woman walking back to Christmas dinner with her son and his new girlfriend, surrounded by family who valued her presence rather than her bank account, knew better. I had choices. I had worth. I had a life that belonged to me, not to other people's expectations or demands. And for the first time in years, I was truly, deeply happy. As we reached the house, Marcus paused at the front door. "Thank you, Mom," he said quietly, "for loving me enough to let me fall down and for believing I was strong enough to get back up." I squeezed his hand and smiled. "Thank you for proving me right." Inside, Margaret was serving coffee and pie. Sarah was helping Carol with a jigsaw puzzle, and James was building a fire in the fireplace. It was the kind of Christmas evening I had dreamed of for years, not because it was elaborate or expensive, but because it was real. As I settled into my chair with a cup of coffee and watched the people I loved enjoying each other's company, I realized that this was what happiness actually looked like: not getting everything you want, but wanting what you have and knowing that you deserve it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.